The silence before an execution is the loudest thing in the universe. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had stood in many silences. Conference halls on Tharkon Prime. The deep vacuum pauses between burst transmissions on the relay arc. The held breath of a room where 17 species sat deciding whether to go to war. She had learned to read silence the way a sailor reads the sea, its weight, its temperature, what it was about to become. This silence was different. It had teeth. The Keth chamber was built for awe. 1,000 meters of obsidian black mineral stretched upward in smooth curves, lit from within by bioluminescent veins of violet and amber. 32 Keth adjudicators sat in concentric rings above her, their carapaces gleaming like polished armor, their compound eyes catching every photon of light and giving nothing back. Below Elena, the floor was transparent. Beneath it, the gas giant Kethvar churned in perpetual storm. A reminder, she had been told once, that all things that do not belong here fall. She had been stripped of her diplomatic credentials 41 minutes ago. Her comlink had gone dark 38 minutes ago. The Keth had jammed every human frequency 26 minutes ago. Elena Vasquez stood with her hands behind her back, her uniform still crisp, her breathing still even, and she calculated. The lead adjudicator, first of rings Vethka, descended slowly on a platform of humming anti-grav rings. Its translator node, attached to its thorax like a silver barnacle, clicked and buzzed before converting its speech into standard. Ambassador, you have been found in violation of the sovereignty accords. You have transmitted intelligence from within Keth space to human military command. The penalty under Keth law is singular and non-negotiable. Elena looked up at it without blinking. I transmitted nothing that wasn't already public record in 17 star systems. The content is irrelevant. The act is the crime. Then your law is not law, it's a trap. The chamber stirred. 32 sets of compound eyes shifted. The bioluminescent veins pulsed faster. Vethka descended to eye level. Up close, it was massive. 2 meters of chitinous geometry, limbs folded into architectural precision. Its mandibles moved slowly, almost thoughtfully. You are not afraid, it observed. No, Elena said. You should be. You are one human. Your government is 8 days away at maximum warp. The Galactic Council is in recess. No one is coming for you, Ambassador. Elena Vasquez smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 31 years studying every sentient species that humanity had encountered. It was the smile of someone who understood, in deep and cellular ways, exactly what the Keth had just done wrong. She reached into the breast pocket of her uniform, slowly so they wouldn't trigger their weapons, and removed a small silver data chip. This, she said quietly, is my final diplomatic message to the Keth sovereignty. I would like it transmitted to your High Council, to the Galactic Council Emergency Relay, and to the Tharkon Diplomatic Archive. She set it gently on the floor between them. I recorded it 11 minutes ago when I still had access to your internal network. Vethka stared at the chip. You were sealed from our network 26 minutes ago. Yes, Elena agreed. I was. She did not elaborate. Vethka reached out with one articulated limb and picked up the chip. It studied it for a long moment. What does it contain? Elena folded her hands behind her back again. She looked up at the churning gas giant through the transparent floor. She thought about her daughter, who was 9 years old and collecting rocks. She thought about the way coffee smelled in the morning on Earth. She thought about the 31 years she had given to keeping humanity and the galaxy from destroying each other. She looked back at Vethka. Everything, she said. The execution was carried out 14 minutes later. It was broadcast, as all Keth executions were, across the sovereignty's public network, as a demonstration of law, of order, of the consequence of transgression. It was the single most catastrophic mistake in Keth history, because 11 minutes before she died, Elena Vasquez had sent a message. And the Keth, in their certainty that she was alone, had broadcast it to the entire galaxy. 8 days, 14 hours, and 9 minutes after Ambassador Elena Vasquez was executed on the Keth Sovereignty's public broadcast, the UES Indomitable dropped out of FTL at the edge of Keth space. It was not alone. The Keth border station at Outpost Keth 7 had standing orders for unauthorized vessels. Challenge, demand identification, escalate to weapons lock if non-compliant. The station commander, a junior adjudicator named Pesht, followed protocol to the letter. He hailed the lead vessel. He demanded identification. He received a response in clean, precise standard. This is Fleet Admiral Marin Okoro, commanding the 7th and 9th Combined Fleets of the United Earth Sovereignty. You have 14 minutes to open a direct channel to First of Rings Vethka and every surviving member of the High Council. After 14 minutes, this negotiation concludes. Pesht looked at his sensor array. Then he looked again. He counted 217 warships. He opened the channel to Vethka in 11 minutes. The Keth High Council convened an emergency session for the first time in 400 years. The chamber was the same obsidian vault where Elena Vasquez had died, now scrubbed clean, newly lit, filled with the highest authorities of the sovereignty. Vethka took the central position. The adjudicators arranged themselves in their traditional rings. Admiral Marin Okoro appeared on the chamber's projection field. She was a small woman by some physical measures, compact, precise, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of stillness that only comes from decades of command. She wore her fleet admiral's uniform as though it were skin. There was no anger visible on her face. There was something worse than anger. There was patience. First of Rings Vethka, she said. I will not insult this council with pretense. You executed our ambassador under manufactured charges. You broadcast her death as a public spectacle. You jammed her communications so she could not call for help. Vethka's translator clicked. The ambassador violated the Sovereignty Accord's Keth law. I know your law, Okoro said. I read Elena Vasquez's file the night she died. 31 years of service. Fluent in 42 languages. She negotiated the Tharkon Water Rights Accord, the Velhari ceasefire, and the Marek Corridor trade agreements. She had 3 commendations from the Galactic Council, and a daughter named Sasha who is 9 years old, and likes rocks. The chamber was very still. Elena Vasquez spent her entire career protecting species that did not deserve her, including yours. And you killed her because she committed the act of existing in your space while being human. The charges were... I know the charges. I also know the message. The words landed in the chamber like stones dropped in still water. Ripples moved through the ranks of adjudicators. Compound eyes flickered. Admiral Okoro reached to her side and activated a secondary display. Elena Vasquez appeared, alive, standing, recorded 11 minutes before her death in the Keth chamber itself, speaking directly into the camera she had hidden in her diplomatic pin. If you are watching this, I am dead. I want you to know 3 things. Her voice was even, unhurried. She sounded, impossibly, like someone who had simply decided something. First, the Keth have been systematically falsifying trade data submitted to the Galactic Council for 11 years. The evidence is encoded in the second layer of this message. The adjudicators began to move. Vethka raised a limb for silence. Second, the Keth have been covertly supplying weapons to the Mareshi separatists, who are responsible for the destruction of 3 civilian colony ships in the Outer Reach. The supply manifests are in the third layer. The chamber was no longer still, it was fracturing. Third, I am choosing to die here instead of escaping because if I die here, everything I know becomes a martyr's testimony, and humanity will come, not to conquer, to be witnessed. Elena looked directly into the camera. Her eyes were dark and steady. Tell them I wasn't afraid. Tell them I knew exactly what I was doing. Tell them... She paused, and for just a moment something human moved across her face. Tell Sasha that rocks are how the Earth remembers itself. The message ended. The Keth High Council sat in a silence that had no teeth, only weight. Admiral Okoro let it sit for a long time before she spoke again. She sent that message to the Galactic Council Emergency Relay, the Tharkon Diplomatic Archive, and 612 other repositories across the known galaxy. She sent it using your own broadcast network, The one you were using to transmit her execution. Vethka's translator was very quiet. She used our own signal. She used your own signal, Okoro confirmed. You broadcast her death to the galaxy. She broadcast your crimes to the galaxy, at the same time, on the same frequency. The silence that followed was the longest in 400 years of Keth history. The Galactic Council had not convened an emergency session in 37 years. The last time had been the Velhari collapse, when a star system's governing body had simply ceased to exist overnight, leaving 17 billion souls without representation and 3 neighboring empires eyeing the resulting void. That session had lasted 4 days. The Elena Vasquez session lasted 11 hours. The Tharkon delegation moved first, formally, procedurally, devastatingly. Tharkon had signed the water rights accord that Elena Vasquez had negotiated. They had sat across from her for 3 years of talks. Their lead delegate, Ambassador Sorath, was 140 years old and had the energy of something much older. He rose to speak, and the chamber went quiet in the way it only does for those who have genuinely earned it. The Keth sovereignty has submitted falsified trade data to this council for 11 years, Sorath said. This is not an allegation. The evidence provided in Ambassador Vasquez's message has been verified by our own archivists. The discrepancies amount to a systematic misrepresentation of resource extraction in the outer reach, a misrepresentation that allowed Keth-aligned corporations to hold monopolies that are illegal under council charter. He paused. He looked around the chamber. She knew this. She spent 3 years uncovering it, and instead of using it as leverage for human interests, instead of trading it for concessions, for territory, for advantage, she included it in a message she knew would only be read after her death, so that the council could act on it without humanity claiming credit. Another pause. Do you understand what that means? She died to give us clean information. She refused to let her own government use it as a weapon because she believed the truth should not be a transaction. The Velhari Confederation moved second. The weapons supply to the Mareshi separatists was not a political abstraction for them. 3 civilian colony ships, 4,217 people. The Velhari had been asking the council for 4 years to investigate Mareshi weapons sources. They had been told there was insufficient evidence. There was now sufficient evidence. The Velhari delegate did not make a speech. He submitted a formal motion for trade sanctions against the Keth sovereignty, suspension of Keth Council membership, and an independent investigation into the Mareshi weapons pipeline. He submitted it in writing. He sat down. He did not look at the Keth delegation once during the entire proceeding. That deliberate refusal to look was in its way more devastating than anything he could have said. The third blow came from within. The Keth had 3 client species, smaller civilizations that existed in their sphere of influence, their economies tied to Keth trade networks, their military postures shaped by Keth security guarantees. The Vithani, the Prosek, the Low Mareshi tribes who had not joined the separatists. The falsified trade data had affected them too. The monopolies held by Keith corporations had been bleeding Vithani resource exports for 6 years. Prosek technology licensing had been artificially inflated. The Low Mareshi had been paying protection fees to a sovereignty that was secretly arming the people attacking them. All 3 client species filed for independent council observer status within 48 hours of the message going public. They did it simultaneously, a coordination that could only mean they had been planning it, waiting, hoping someone would create an opening. Elena Vasquez had created the opening. In the Keth chamber, Vethka sat very still while Admiral Okoro laid out the human position with the methodical precision of someone who had been briefed by the best diplomatic minds on Earth. We are not asking for war reparations. We are not asking for territory. We are not asking for a formal apology, though one would not be refused. Okoro paused. We are asking for 3 things. First, the public acknowledgement of Ambassador Vasquez's status as a diplomat unlawfully executed under manufactured charges, and the formal restoration of her record. Second, immediate compliance with the Galactic Council's investigation. Third, the establishment of a Vasquez Protocol, an ironclad diplomatic immunity guarantee for all species ambassadors operating in Keth space, ratified by the Council and enforceable by collective sanction. "And if we refuse?" Vethka asked very quietly. Admiral Okoro looked at the compound eyes of the First of Rings, the being that had looked at Elena Vasquez, and decided she was alone, that no one was coming, that she could simply be ended. "You won't," she said. She was right. The Keth capitulated within 72 hours, not because of the 217 warships parked at their border, though those were persuasive, not because of the Galactic Council sanctions, though those were economically catastrophic. They capitulated because their own people had watched the broadcast. The same network they had used to demonstrate their power had shown their crimes to every Keth citizen. The same public spectacle meant to intimidate had become a confession. The philosophical foundation of Keth governance, the idea that law was absolute, that the sovereignty was righteous, that order justified any action, had cracked at its base. They had executed the wrong person. Not because she was powerful, not because she was protected, but because she was right and she had known exactly how to make the truth survive her. The phrase "ended 3 civilizations" would be debated by historians for 200 years after the Vasquez incident. Most would argue it was imprecise, that the Keth sovereignty continued to exist, that the Vithani and Prosek did not cease to be. They would argue that transformed was more accurate, or restructured, or fundamentally altered. They were right technically, but they were missing the point in the way that historians often miss the point of the things they lived too late to feel. The Keth sovereignty that existed before Elena Vasquez died was gone. Completely, irretrievably gone. Not the buildings or the species or the stars they orbited, but the thing that made the Keth sovereignty, the unquestionable authority, the philosophical certainty that order and power were the same thing, the ability to look at a lone human diplomat and see someone disposable. That Keth sovereignty ended. What replaced it was smaller, quieter, and considerably more honest. The reform movement that had been quietly building for 2 decades found its moment in the weeks after the broadcast. Vethka was removed from the First of Rings position within 3 months, not by human pressure, not by council mandate, but by a Keth internal process that had never successfully unseated a first before. The reform delegates took 6 of the 12 high council seats in the following cycle. They began the slow, difficult, profoundly uncomfortable work of actually reading the sovereignty's own records. What they found was worse than the council already knew. The falsified trade data was the beginning. Underneath it were decades of quiet policy, the deliberate suppression of Vithani technological development, because a more advanced Vithani would be a less dependent Vithani. The covert inflation of Prosek licensing fees, channeled through shell entities into Keth military R&D. The low Mareshi protection fees, used to fund the very separatist movement they were allegedly being protected from, because a stable low Mareshi would eventually want independence and an unstable one would keep paying. The Keth reformers released all of it, voluntarily, without being asked. When journalists from 6 species asked the new reform leader, Second of Rings Athek, why they were doing this, she said something that was transmitted galaxy-wide and quoted for a century afterward. Because a human diplomat died so that the truth could not die with her. The least we can do is let her be right. The Vithani civil government reformed within a year. Free of artificial economic constraints, their technology sector, already the most inventive in the Keth sphere, exploded into a development surge that would, within 30 years, make them the leading terraforming civilization in the outer reach. They named their first fully independent colonial vessel the Elena Vasquez. The Prosek renegotiated every trade agreement they had signed under Keth influence. The process took 4 years, and was often ugly and contentious. At the end of it, they emerged with genuine market access for the first time in 3 generations. Their lead negotiator kept a printed copy of Elena Vasquez's final message at her desk throughout the entire process. The Mareshi situation was the most complex. The separatist movement, deprived of its Keth weapons supply and exposed in the council investigation, fractured. Some factions chose to negotiate. Some dissolved. A handful became more radical before eventually exhausting themselves. The low Mareshi tribes, free of protection fees and with access to council arbitration, negotiated a federated independence framework that gave them genuine self-governance for the first time in recorded history. The process was not clean or swift or satisfying. It was real. 3 civilizations gone in the sense that mattered, 3 new ones in their place. On Earth, in a small apartment in Nairobi, a 9-year-old girl named Sasha Vasquez watched the council session proceedings on her mother's old tablet. Her aunt sat beside her, not quite sure what to say. Sasha didn't need her to say anything. She watched Admiral Okoro speak. She watched the Tharkon ambassador cite her mother by name. She watched the vote pass. The Vasquez Protocol, unanimous, 37 species in favor, 0 opposed. She picked up the rock she'd been holding, a piece of red Martian basalt her mother had brought her on her last home visit, and turned it over in her hands. She didn't cry. She was her mother's daughter. Admiral Marin Okoro wrote a letter to Sasha Vasquez the night after the Keth capitulation. It was not an official communication. She wrote it by hand, on paper, which she had not done since she was a lieutenant, and her commanding officer told her that some things deserved the weight of physical ink. She wrote, "Your mother was the bravest person I have ever known. Not because she wasn't afraid. I don't believe that, and I think she would have laughed at anyone who said it. Brave because she was afraid, and she did it anyway. Brave because she saw clearly what was going to happen, and she decided in those 11 minutes not to run. She decided instead to make her death mean something so large that the galaxy couldn't look away from it. She protected 4,000 dead civilians in the outer reach. She protected 3 species who didn't know they needed protecting. She protected every diplomat who will ever work in Keth space for the rest of recorded time. She did all of that in 11 minutes with a hidden camera and a data chip and the knowledge that she was completely, utterly alone. She was not alone. She is not alone. She will not be." Okoro folded the letter, sealed it, and marked it for personal delivery. Then she sat at her desk for a long time, in the quiet of her flagship, watching Keth space through the viewport. 217 warships, the largest peacetime fleet deployment in human history. She had moved them without firing a single shot. She had parked them at the edge of an empire and said, "Look at what we can do," and then chose not to do it. That was Elena Vasquez's strategy, carried forward. Not the weapon, the witness. The Galactic Council formalized the Vasquez Protocol in a ceremony 6 months later. Every species with council membership sent a delegate. The Tharkon ambassador Sorath spoke. Several others spoke. By tradition, a representative of the diplomat's home species was given the closing address. Humanity sent Sasha Vasquez. She was 9 years old. She stood at a podium in a chamber that held 37 civilizations, and she was very small, and she held the piece of red Martian basalt her mother had given her, and she spoke without notes for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The recording of those 3 minutes and 40 seconds would be studied in diplomatic academies for 100 years. Not because she said anything technically remarkable, because she said true things simply, and in that chamber full of the oldest and most complex civilizations in the known galaxy, simple truth still moved everything. She ended with her mother's words because they were the right words and they belong to everyone now. Rocks are how the earth remembers itself. She held up the basalt so the whole chamber could see it. My mother remembered herself. I hope you remember her. I hope you remember what she showed you about what one person can do when they stop being afraid of being alone. She stepped down from the podium. 37 civilizations gave her the first standing ovation in council history. Outside the chamber, through the great observation windows, the stars were exactly what they had always been. Indifferent, ancient, burning. But something had changed in the space between them. Not the distance, not the physics, the understanding. The Keth had looked at Elena Vasquez and seen one human, alone, with no army coming, no rescue possible, no leverage left. They had seen disposable. They had not understood. They could not have understood, because no species that had not spent centuries watching humanity had any framework for it. That being alone had never stopped a human from doing the thing that needed to be done, that the army always came, that the message always got through, that 11 minutes for a human who had decided something was more than enough time to end 3 civilizations and build 3 more. In a small apartment in Nairobi, A 9-year-old girl sat on the floor surrounded by rocks and read the stars the way her mother had taught her. Not as obstacles or waypoints, but as witnesses, all of them watching, all of them remembering. The Velthari called it the correction. Every species in the known galaxy had a different name for what happened to humanity 1,000 years ago. The Drenkai called it the culling of the loud ones. The Sorathi collective referred to it in their historical archives as the taming of the feral world. The Galactic Conclave and the governing body of 47 sentient species had an official term buried in Directive 7 of the Pacification Protocols. They called it necessary intervention. Humanity called it something else entirely. They called it the day the sky burned. It began, as most catastrophes do, not with a warning, but with a silence. On the morning of what humans had once marked as March 14th, every satellite above Earth went dark simultaneously. Every radio signal died. Every digital transmission flatlined. Billions of humans looked up from their screens, from their breakfast tables, from their children's faces, and felt, in that animal part of the brain that evolution had never quite managed to silence, that something was wrong. They were right. The Velthari fleet entered Earth's atmosphere not from orbit but from within it, a technology so advanced that human radar systems registered nothing until 3,000 warships materialized inside the cloud layer simultaneously, blotting out the sun across every continent at once. The shadow that fell over Earth that morning was not the shadow of a single ship. It was the shadow of an empire. 17 minutes. That was how long humanity's combined military response lasted. 17 minutes of missiles that vaporized before they reached their targets. 17 minutes of fighter jets that fell from the sky like burning leaves. 17 minutes of every nuclear launch code failing simultaneously, every submarine running dark, every defense grid dissolving as though it had been made of paper. And then, silence. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of demonstration. The Velthari had not come to destroy humanity. Destruction was easy. Destruction was wasteful. The Velthari Empire, spanning 40 star systems and commanding 8 subjugated species, had learned long ago that the most profitable thing you could do with a violent, resourceful, dangerously creative species was not to kill them. It was to own them. The Velthari Supreme Commander, a creature named Vreth Solan, whose forearms moved like the legs of a patient spider, broadcast his first message to Earth in 17 languages simultaneously. His translators had been studying human communications for 60 years. He spoke with the calm, measured tone of someone reading a grocery list. People of Earth, your resistance has been noted. It has also been concluded. You are now subjects of the Velthari Dominion. Compliance will be rewarded with survival. Non-compliance will be answered with the complete sterilization of your planetary biosphere. You have 24 of your hours to choose. They chose survival. Of course they chose survival. Humans always chose survival. The Velthari counted on it. What they did not fully account for, what their 60 years of surveillance, their behavioral models, their probability matrices, and their 11 xenopsychology departments had somehow missed, was what survival looks like when humanity is the one doing it. The chains went on. The work began. The galaxy looked away, satisfied. And somewhere in the dark, behind the eyes of every enslaved human on Earth and in the labor camps of 40 star systems, something woke up. Something that had no name yet. Something that was patient. The first century was the worst. Not because of the violence, though there was violence enough to fill libraries. Not because of the starvation, the displacement, the forced relocation of entire populations to mining worlds at the edge of the Velthari Dominion's territory. The first century was the worst because of the hope. Hope is the cruelest thing you can carry into captivity. It tells you that tomorrow will be different. And when tomorrow comes and is exactly the same as today, hope doesn't quietly die. It screams on the way out. By the end of the first century, most of humanity had stopped hoping. This the Velthari mistook for submission. A Velthari overseer named Keth Varun, stationed at Labor Complex 17 on the mineral moon of Dregath IV, wrote in his personal log during year 93 of the occupation, "The humans have settled well. Their biological endurance is remarkable. They can work longer hours in higher gravity than any of our other subject species. Their cognitive functions remain elevated even under nutritional restrictions that would incapacitate a Sarathi within days. Most importantly, they have ceased their organized resistance. They comply, they work, they survive. Whatever spirit animated their violence in the early years appears to have been extinguished. Keth Varun was a meticulous record keeper. He filed his logs every 7 days for 30 years. He never noticed the education. It happened in the dark, in the hours between the end of a shift and the beginning of sleep, in the sub-levels of labor complexes where the environmental sensors were old and the Velthari overseers had learned not to bother. It happened in whispers, then in organized quiet, then in an entire underground institution that had no name and no location, and no records that any scanner could find. The humans were teaching each other, not how to read. Most could already read. They were teaching each other everything: engineering, physics, chemistry, xenobiology, the technical specifications of Velthari weaponry that workers gleaned through years of proximity and sharp eyes, and the pretense of total disinterest. The navigation charts that pilots memorized and passed down like prayers. The power signatures of Velthari shielding systems, reverse-engineered over decades by humans who fixed those systems every time they broke and remembered every component they touched. A woman named Sarah Voss, born in a labor camp on Dragath IV in year 112, is credited in what later historians would call the Book of Patience, with the statement that defined the next 9 centuries of human existence. She said it quietly, to a room of 30 children who were supposed to be sleeping. "We are not going to fight them yet. We don't know enough yet. Learn everything. Forget nothing. Tell your children. We are building something they cannot see." She died at the age of 61, never having seen the sky of Earth. Her granddaughter became the first human to successfully bypass a Velthari weapons lock from the inside. Her great-granddaughter designed the first iteration of what would eventually become humanity's most feared military asset. They called it the Answer. The Velthari, meanwhile, grew comfortable. This is a pattern that repeats throughout galactic history with disturbing regularity: the comfort of the conqueror. The Velthari had subjugated 8 species before humanity. All 8 had followed the same arc: initial resistance, gradual compliance, eventual integration into the labor economy, and finally, the slow cultural erosion that made them useful, manageable, and permanently harmless. The Velthari expected humanity to follow the same arc. What the Velthari did not understand, what the entire galactic community did not understand, was that all 8 of those species had something in common that humanity lacked. They had all been conquered after achieving peace. The Sarathi had spent 500 years in harmonious collective governance before the Velthari arrived. The Drenkai had abolished warfare among themselves 2 centuries before first contact. Every species the Velthari had ever successfully subjugated had, at the moment of conquest, already forgotten how to survive under existential pressure. Humanity had not. Humanity had never stopped. Humanity had crawled out of ice ages and survived plagues and rebuilt after world wars and clawed its way back from every extinction-level pressure the universe had thrown at it for 300,000 years. Humanity did not have a cultural memory of peace the way other species did. Humanity had a cultural memory of endurance, of adaptation, of looking at the thing that was trying to kill you, studying it with furious, burning, total attention, and then building something that killed it back. The Velthari had not conquered a civilization. They had poked a species that had been practicing for this exact scenario its entire existence. By year 300, the underground network had a name, not a word, a signal. 3 short taps in a specific rhythm that could be passed through any surface, through any wall, through any crowd. It meant, I know. I remember. I'm ready. By year 500 they had ships, not Velthari ships, not stolen ships, not repaired ships, not retrofitted cargo haulers. Ships that had been built, component by component over decades in sublevels and abandoned maintenance tunnels and the hollow spaces beneath labor complex floors. Ships built from materials that the Veltari had catalogued as industrial waste. Ships whose power signatures had been specifically designed to read as background radiation on Veltari scanners. Ships that were, by any engineering standard the galaxy had ever established, impossible. The Veltari never found them. Not once. In 500 years of occupation with surveillance technology sophisticated enough to detect a single unauthorized thought wave, they never found a single ship. Because the humans had learned something the Veltari never considered teaching them: how to be invisible. By year 800 they had a fleet. By year 992 they had something else. They had a plan. Supreme Commander Vreth Solan IV, great-great-great-great-grandson of the original Vreth Solan, was presiding over the millennial celebration of the Earth correction when it happened. The celebration was being broadcast across 37 star systems. Representatives from every species in the galactic conclave attended in person or via quantum relay. It was meant to be a showcase of Veltari power, a reminder that the galaxy's most dominant empire had, 1,000 years ago, successfully neutralized the only species that had ever been assessed as a long-term galactic threat. The humans performed their ceremonial labor for the assembled dignitaries. They moved in their work formations with the practiced, quiet efficiency that 1,000 years of occupation had produced. The Veltari commentators narrated their movements with the clinical pride of someone displaying livestock. Note the compliance rate, 99.7% across all labor complexes. Note the productivity metrics, which have only increased over the centuries. Note the absence of any organized resistance activity in the past 400 years. The humans are, by every measurable standard, successfully integrated. The Galactic Conclave nodded and recorded their approval. Vreth Solan IV raised his primary arms in the ceremonial gesture of dominion. At that precise moment, every human in every labor complex across 40 star systems stopped working. Not gradually, not in stages, all of them, simultaneously, as though a single switch had been thrown in the consciousness of every human being alive. The Veltari overseers registered the work stoppage and immediately triggered the compliance systems, the neural suppressors embedded in the labor complex infrastructure that had been used to manage human behavior for centuries. The systems activated, delivered their standard deterrent signal. Nothing happened. Because while the Veltari had been celebrating, human engineers had spent the last 6 months systematically replacing the internal components of every neural suppressor in every labor complex with devices that looked identical and scanned identical, but did absolutely nothing except report normal function to the monitoring network. The compliance systems were ghost systems. They had been ghost systems for 6 months. The Veltari had been managing a simulation of compliance while the humans prepared. What happened next took 11 minutes. Not because it was difficult, because the humans had decided that 11 minutes was the appropriate amount of time to take. Long enough to be thorough, short enough to be a message. The labor complex doors opened from the inside. This should have been impossible. The doors were controlled from external stations staffed by Veltari personnel. Except that the humans who maintained those control stations had, over the past decade, made certain modifications to the internal architecture of the door control systems. Modifications invisible to any standard diagnostic. Modifications that, on a specific signal, transferred complete control of every door in every complex to a network that had been built inside the complex walls themselves. The humans walked out, on Dregath IV, on Kalora Station, on the frozen labor continent of Murseft, on 18 mining platforms and 11 agricultural worlds and 432 individual facilities spread across the breadth of the Veltari Dominion. The humans walked out into the open and looked up at the sky, and the sky answered. The fleet emerged from what the Veltari called dead space, the regions between star systems where no vessel was expected to travel because the gravitational mathematics made navigation theoretically impossible. It emerged not from one direction, but from every direction simultaneously. 612 warships, built over 5 centuries in the hidden spaces of the Veltari Dominion, equipped with weapon systems that the galaxy had never seen, powered by an engine architecture that Velthari physicists would later spend decades trying to understand. The fleet moved like it was angry. Because it was. Every ship had a name. Not a designation number. A name. Named for the humans who had built the knowledge that built the ship. Sarah Voss. Commander Tallis Webb, who had stolen Velthari navigation codes by memorizing them through a ventilation grate. Engineer Davon Holt, who had lost 3 fingers to a Velthari overseer's discipline rod and spent the next 20 years designing the shield-piercing technology those overseers' descendants would die to. Every ship was a monument, every ship was a reckoning. Vreth Salandavou stared at his command display in the 17 seconds he had before the communication channels lit up with emergency signals from across the Dominion. He said one thing. This is not possible. The human fleet's first transmission was not a battle cry. It was not a declaration of war. It was a single audio file, broadcast on every frequency the Velthari used, on every relay they owned, amplified by communication infrastructure that humans had quietly modified over decades to serve this exact purpose. It was a recording. 1,000 years old. The voice of Vreth Solan I, calm and measured, reading his grocery list of Dominion. Compliance will be rewarded with survival. And then, in a voice that was not calm, in a voice that carried 1,000 years of everything they had swallowed and remembered and weaponized. We remember. The Battle of Dragath, as the galaxy named it, because they needed to call it something, lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Not because the humans needed 4 hours, because they gave the Velthari fleet 3 hours and 50 minutes to surrender, and used the remaining 27 minutes to eliminate the ones that chose not to. The Velthari Supreme Commander survived. This was not an accident. The humans had been very specific about who survived that day, not out of mercy, out of intent. Vreth Solan I was escorted, in full view of every quantum relay in the galaxy, to a room on the human flagship Sarah Voss. He sat across a table from a human woman named Commander Ilya Marsh. She was 63 years old. She had been born in a labor complex. She had never in her life seen the planet her ancestors had called home. She put a document on the table. She said, "Read it. Sign it. Then you're going to help us deliver it to every member of the Galactic Conclave personally." He read it. Then he understood for the first time and far too late exactly what humanity had spent 1,000 years building. Not just a fleet, not just freedom, a precedent. The document Vreth Solan before signed was not a peace treaty. It was not a ceasefire. It was not a charter of rights or a declaration of independence or any of the forms of paper that species across the galaxy had used to mark the end of conflicts. It was something the Galactic Conclave had never encountered in 40,000 years of recorded interstellar history. It was a bill, itemized, precise, documented with the kind of meticulous, devastating detail that comes from a species that had spent 1,000 years doing nothing but remembering and recording. Line 1. 1,000 years of unrecompensed labor across 40 star systems. The calculation ran to 12 pages. The humans had tracked every hour, every worker, every mineral extracted, every field cultivated, every ship repaired, every structure built across the breadth of the Velthari Dominion for 10 centuries. The number at the bottom of page 12 was so large that the Velthari economic advisors, when they first saw it, assumed there had been a mathematical error. There had not. Line 2. Biological damages. Every human who had died in captivity, every life shortened by labor conditions, every medical need unmet, every child born into chains. The humans had genealogical records. They had tracked family lines across 1,000 years with a precision that stunned galactic archivists. They knew exactly how many of them there had been. They knew exactly how many were gone. The calculation on this line was even longer than the first. Line 3, and this was the line that made the Galactic Conclave chamber go absolutely silent when it was read aloud, was titled simply, Interest. The above amounts, Commander Marsh said, addressing the full assembly of the Galactic Conclave 3 weeks after the Battle of Dragath, represent what the Velthari Dominion owes humanity. The interest calculation represents what the galaxy owes humanity for 1,000 years of silence. 46 pairs of alien eyes, spread across 47 species, stared at her. "You watched," she said. "Every one of you. You had the technology to intervene. Several of you had the military capacity to challenge the Velthari Dominion individually, let alone collectively. You chose not to. You chose to look away. You chose to continue trading with an empire that had enslaved a sapient species. You chose to attend their celebrations. She let that land. We remember that too." The Sarathi ambassador began to speak. Marsh raised one hand. He stopped. "We are not here to negotiate," she said. "We are here because we are giving you the opportunity to make a choice. You had that opportunity 1,000 years ago and you made it. Today you get to make a different one. The bill will be paid. The only question is how." What followed was not a war. Not quite. The galaxy had looked at what humanity had done to the most powerful military force in the known universe in 4 hours and 17 minutes, and the galaxy had made a very quiet, very rapid collective decision that it did not want to find out what humanity could do with motivation, time, and grievance of this scale. The bill was paid. Not all at once. The economic reality of 40 star systems changing hands simultaneously was a logistical challenge even by galactic standards, but it was paid. World by world. Resource by resource. Technology transfer by technology transfer. The Velthari Dominion did not collapse so much as it was methodically dismantled and its components redistributed, with humanity serving as the final authority on what went where and to whom. And Earth, the planet that 1,000 years of slaves had described to their children the way other species described paradise, the blue marble that existed in human cultural memory as something between a home and a religion. Earth was restored. Not the Earth of the day the sky burned. That Earth was gone. The Velthari had modified its atmosphere in the early years of occupation to better suit their administrative personnel. They had restructured its agriculture, altered its ecology, stripped its orbital space of everything built by human hands. The restoration project took 30 years and involved engineering teams from 11 species who were not so much volunteering as they were extremely motivated to appear cooperative. When it was done, when the atmospheric composition matched the records and the oceans were clean and the skies were the specific shade of blue that appeared in 10,000 years of human art, the first generation of humans to set foot on their ancestral world were not the generals or the commanders or the architects of the liberation. They were children. Specifically, 412 children from the labor complex on Dregath IV, chosen by lottery, aged between 6 and 12. They were brought down in a single transport and released into an open field outside what had once been called Stockholm and was now simply called home, and the cameras that broadcast that moment across 37 star systems captured the exact instant when the first child felt actual earth grass under her feet for the first time. She sat down in it immediately. She pressed both palms flat against the ground. She looked like she was listening to something. Later, when asked what she had been doing, she said she was saying hello. Aboard the galactic relay stations, species that had spent 1,000 years not looking at humanity watched that broadcast in complete silence. But the bill was not the end. The bill was the beginning. Commander Marsh, now Premier Marsh of the Terran Recovery Authority, had said 10,000 years. The galaxy had assumed this was rhetoric, dramatic language from a species in the emotional aftermath of liberation. The galaxy was wrong. Humanity had spent 1,000 years building something they called the Long Doctrine. It was simple. It had 3 parts. First, never again. Not for humans. Not for anyone. Every labor complex in the Velthari Dominion had contained humans. Several had contained members of other species, lesser operations, smaller-scale exploitation that the Galactic Conclave had technically prohibited but practically ignored. Humanity catalogued all of it. Humanity tracked every sentient being that had passed through a Velthari facility. Humanity built a new institution, not the Galactic Conclave which had proven what it was, and named it the Watch. The Watch had one purpose: to notice. to record, to ensure that what had happened to humanity could not happen again without the galaxy having to look directly at it. Second, build. The knowledge accumulated over 1,000 years of underground education had produced something extraordinary. Humanity had reverse-engineered Veltari technology, and then surpassed it in several key areas within the first century of working openly. The engine systems that had made the Liberation Fleet's navigation through dead space possible were based on physics that Veltari science had classified as theoretically impossible. Humanity had not read that classification as a limitation. They had read it as a starting point. Within 50 years of liberation, human engineering had become the most sought-after commodity in the galaxy, not because humanity was selling it freely, but because humanity was selectively offering it in exchange for something the galaxy had a difficult time providing: accountability. Every technology transfer came with terms. The terms were always the same: open records, transparent governance, regular watch inspections. The galaxy grumbled, the galaxy complied, because the alternative, having the humans decide you were not worth trading with, was a category of problem that nobody wanted. Third, remember. This was the quiet one. The one the galaxy understood least, in the early years. Humanity built no monuments to the liberation. They built monuments to the enslavement. On every world where a labor complex had stood, where human hands had worked without choice for Veltari profit, they built a monument. Simple, precise. Just walls, covered in names. Every name they had. The ones they knew and the ones they had reconstructed from records and the ones listed only by the designation numbers the Veltari had assigned them. Species across the galaxy found these monuments deeply uncomfortable. Several ambassadors suggested delicately that humanity might consider focusing on the victory rather than the wound. Humanity declined, delicately, because the monuments were not for the dead, they were for the living, so that the living would never in any generation, in any comfort, in any prosperity, forget what had been done and what it had cost and what it had taken to answer it, so that no human child would ever grow up thinking that the galaxy was safe by default, so that the species that had outlasted 1,000 years of chains would never make the mistake of the Sorathi or the Drenkai, or the 7 other species who had been conquered because they had forgotten how to survive. 50 years after liberation, a young Veltari scholar, one of the new generation born after the Dominion's dissolution, published a paper that became required reading across the galaxy. It was a historical analysis of the occupation and its aftermath. Its final paragraph read, "We have spent the decades since liberation attempting to understand how we failed to see what was happening beneath our surveillance systems, within our own facilities in the spaces we believed we controlled completely. The answer, I believe, is simple and devastating. We were looking for the things we feared. We feared rebellion. We feared weapons. We feared the dramatic, visible, sudden reversal. We surveilled for those things obsessively. What we did not surveil for, what it perhaps never occurred to us to surveil for, was patience. We had no category for a species that could sustain coordinated, purposeful generational action for 10 centuries without a single detectable breach. We had no framework for a civilization that could hold a plan for 500 years and not have a single member, not one, in billions, break silence out of desperation or fear, or the simple human need to be heard. We did not understand what we were dealing with. We thought we had tamed something. In truth, we had given it 1,000 years to sharpen itself against us. And when it was sharp enough, it cut. The paper was titled, "On the Nature of Things We Chose Not to Understand." It was distributed by the Watch to every member species of the new Galactic Assembly, with a simple note attached in the margin in humanity's hand. Read it twice. And the galaxy read it. And the galaxy, for the first time in 40,000 years of recorded interstellar civilization, felt something it had never quite felt before. Not fear of humanity's weapons, not fear of humanity's fleet, not even fear of humanity's patience or their planning or the cold, meticulous precision with which they had engineered the collapse of the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever known. something quieter, something that settled into the galactic consciousness slowly, over years, like a tide coming in. Respect. Not the respect you give to something powerful, the deeper kind. The kind you give to something that earned it the hardest possible way, the kind that doesn't go away. On Dragath 4, where the first labor complex had stood, where Sarah Voss had told 30 children to learn everything and forget nothing, a new structure stood now, not a monument, a school. It had one rule, painted above the entrance in 37 languages. We are building something they cannot see. The children of Dragath 4 went to school there every morning. They learned engineering and physics and history, and the 17 ways that the galaxy had failed them, and the one way that they had refused to fail themselves. And sometimes, in the evenings, when the work of learning was done and the students sat in the grass outside and looked up at the stars, they were not looking at them the way their ancestors had looked up from the floor of a labor complex, with grief and distance and the ache of something lost. They were looking at them the way you look at something that belongs to you, the way you look at something you earned. The galaxy had given humanity 1,000 years of chains. Humanity had returned 10,000 years of consequence. And the ledger, by any accounting, in any currency, across any standard the galaxy had ever devised, was only just beginning to balance. The invitation was supposed to be a joke. That was the part Ambassador Velthari Us would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. That no one on the Galactic Conclave's Outreach Committee had actually meant it. That the name had been added to the official delegation list as an act of inter-office mockery. That Councillor Dra of the Ethian Collective had laughed so hard his secondary breathing slits had gone into spasm when he first proposed it. Send the invitation to humanity, Dra had said, scrolling lazily through the list of uncontacted civilizations flagged as too primitive, too violent, or too unstable for first contact. Send it to the Deathworlders. See what happens. The room had erupted. The Ethians, the Sarathi, the ancient, slow-blinking Sithali who rarely laughed at anything, even they had let out their low, resonant hum of amusement, because the idea was absurd. The Galactic Conclave's Grand Assembly was the most prestigious political body in 7 star systems. Its annual summit of civilizations was attended only by species that had achieved certain benchmarks, sustained faster-than-light travel, a unified planetary government, at least 200 years without large-scale self-inflicted extinction events. Humanity had achieved exactly none of those things. They were a Class 4 developing civilization flagged under 3 separate conclave watchdog designations: volatile, uncontrollable, and most damningly, Origin World Hazard Class Omega. Their planet, a dense high-gravity hyper-oxygenated rock orbiting dangerously close to a volatile yellow star, produced organisms that, by any reasonable biological standard, should not have been able to survive past childhood. Humans ran on a cocktail of adrenaline, stubbornness, and a biochemical pain response that, perversely, seemed to motivate them rather than discourage them. They had also, as of their most recent conflict assessment, been in some form of active war for approximately 93% of their recorded history. Sending them an invitation to the summit of civilizations was like handing a flame to a creature made of dry paper and calling it diplomacy. It was a joke. Councillor Dra filed the invitation anyway, a formal gold-sealed encrypted diplomatic transmission sent through the Conclave's official channel to the coordinates of a small blue-green world on the outer edge of the Orion Arm. He expected no response, or perhaps, if he was lucky, a confused and barely coherent reply from whatever primitive governmental body the humans were currently operating. Something to read aloud at the next committee meeting for a second round of laughs. What he got instead made the laughter stop completely. The 412th Summit of Civilizations opened on the first day of the Conclave's ceremonial calendar, with all the grandeur that 400 years of tradition could produce. The Grand Chamber of Aurum was vast, a tiered amphitheater carved from a single asteroid, its walls inlaid with the sigils of every member civilization, its central floor a mosaic of star maps depicting the 7 systems under conclave governance. It seated 300 delegates. On this occasion, all 300 seats were filled. and a significant number of their occupants had quietly rearranged their schedules when word had spread through diplomatic back channels that the human delegate would be present. Nobody wanted to miss this. The general consensus, as best as it could be summarized across 6 species and multiple translator variants, was that the human would either be quietly absurd and quickly forgotten, or would commit some spectacular diplomatic breach that would be discussed for generations. Either way, worth watching. Dr. Mara Voss took her seat in the gallery reserved for observer civilizations, a polite architectural signal that humanity was present, but not yet a member, acknowledged but not equal. The chair was built for a Sathali delegate, which meant it was roughly 3 times wider than she needed, and featured an integrated nutrient misting function that she ignored. She had brought on a small handheld device what appeared to be written notes. The summit opened with the traditional recitation of the compact, a 90-minute ceremonial reading of the founding principles of the conclave, delivered in all 6 official languages, by 6 senior counselors in rotating order. It was the kind of proceedings that tested the patience of even veteran diplomats. Mara Voss listened to all 90 minutes without looking at her notes, without looking at her device and, as the delegate from the Sarathi would later recount in extensive detail, without once appearing bored. She watched each speaker with the focused attention of someone learning something, which was deeply unsettling to everyone who had expected her to be lost. The first formal session of the summit was a debate on the outer expansion protocols, a long-running dispute between the Ythian Collective and the Sarathi Assembly over territorial rights in the unclaimed systems beyond the 7th star. It was a complex, decades-old argument involving 17 competing treaties, multiple resource claims, and a cultural grievance that dated back to a border incident most of the current delegates had not been alive for. Observer civilizations were not permitted to speak during formal sessions. This rule was, as far as anyone could recall, never broken. It lasted until the 2nd hour of the outer expansion debate, when Councillor Dra-A, apparently still operating under the belief that the human's presence was more performance than threat, gestured toward the observer gallery with a magnanimous sweep of his tendrils and said, "Perhaps our new guest would like to share what a developing civilization thinks of territorial disputes? For educational purposes." The chamber tittered. Several delegates leaned forward. Voss looked up from her notes. "The Varith Clause," she said. Her voice carried without effort across the chamber's acoustics, calm, clear, and completely certain. Article 14, subsection 9 of the Third Expansion Accord, ratified 211 years ago. The Sarathi position on the outer systems is technically valid under current treaty law, but it relies on a clause that was inserted during the negotiations by a Sarathi junior minister who has since been tried and convicted by his own government for treaty fraud. The Ythian Collective's legal team is aware of this. They've chosen not to raise it because doing so would also invalidate the Pathera trade agreement, which benefits Ythia significantly. Both sides are negotiating in bad faith. They have been for 60 years. I can explain what a resolution might actually look like, if anyone is interested. The chamber was silent. Councillor Dra's tendrils had gone still. First Speaker Theris of the Sarathi, who had been in this debate for 26 years, turned slowly in her crystalline seat and looked at the human delegate with an expression that, through the cultural translator, registered as, "I knew it. I knew this would happen." It was Grand Arbiter Mensol, the eldest of the Sathali, who had presided over 4 summits and was not given to drama, who finally spoke. "Ambassador Voss," said Mensol, in a voice like tectonic plates settling, "you are currently seated in the observer gallery." "I am," Voss agreed. "Observer civilizations do not have the floor." "I know. And yet you spoke." "Councillor Dra invited me to." She glanced across the chamber at Dra, who appeared to be attempting to become structurally invisible. "I was being polite." Mensol regarded her for a long moment. The Sathali's slow blinking eyes, each one the size of a dinner plate, moved over Voss with the deliberate patience of a creature that measured time in centuries. "You have read the full treaty archive," Mensol said. It was not a question. The accessible portions, Voss said. There are approximately 2,000 documents in the restricted archive that your public diplomatic records reference but don't publish. I made some educated guesses about those. Educated guesses. Based on the patterns in the documents I could access, cross-referenced with the voting records of the relevant parties and the economic data from the disputed systems. I was probably wrong about some of them. What percentage do you estimate you were wrong about? Voss considered this with the straightforward thoughtfulness of someone doing a quick mental calculation. 17%, she said. Maybe 20. Which meant she was right about 80% of a classified archive she had never seen. The Grand Arbiter looked at her for another long moment. Then Menzel did something that none of the 300 delegates present had ever seen the Grand Arbiter do in 34 years of presiding over summits. She offered the floor. Ambassador Voss of Earth, said Menzel, the Grand Chamber will hear your proposal. What followed over the next 6 hours would later be referred to, in conclave historical records, as the Voss Sessions, a name that was accurate if profoundly understated, like calling a tidal wave the Voss wave event because technically, that was what it was. Mara Voss did not shout. She did not threaten. She did not perform. She simply talked, in the measured, precise tone of someone who had spent a significant portion of her life studying exactly this problem and had run out of patience for the ways powerful institutions avoided solving it. She dismantled the outer expansion dispute in 40 minutes, walking both sides through the legal architecture of their own positions until the fraudulent clause was exposed in full view of every delegate, and then immediately offering a restructured framework that preserved core Wythian trade interests while genuinely addressing the Sarathi territorial concerns. It was not a perfect solution. She said so explicitly. It was a functional one, which was something 6 decades of summit negotiations had failed to produce. She then, without being asked, turned to the secondary agenda. The Drift Cluster humanitarian question. A slow-burning crisis involving the unaffiliated non-member civilizations on the conclave's outer edges, species too small or too resource-poor to meet membership thresholds, effectively abandoned by the same body that claimed to represent all sentient life in the region. This was the item that never made it past the first hour of any summit session, because none of the member civilizations had any direct economic incentive to address it. Voss addressed it. You have a word for this, she said, looking around the chamber. In your diplomatic language, you call it peripheral consideration. We have a different word for it on Earth. We call it abandonment. And we've been doing it to each other since before we had language to name it. I'd like to think you might do better. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. First speaker Theris of the Sarathi, who had spent 26 years opposing every proposal this chamber had ever made, who had been present at 11 summits and been moved by exactly none of them, looked at the human delegate with her slow, crystalline eyes and said quietly, "What do you propose?" The summit recessed at the end of the first day with more achieved than had been accomplished in the previous 4 sessions combined. This was not, in itself, the catastrophic backfire. The catastrophic backfire came on the morning of the second day, when Sub-Councillor Veen, who had by this point progressed through humiliation, anger, and a defensive form of professional jealousy, made the decision to launch what he privately called a re-establishment of context. What he publicly called it was a security briefing. The chamber should be made aware, said Veen, standing at the central floor with the stiff posture of someone executing a plan he had told himself was reasonable, that the civilization currently represented in our observer gallery carries several significant risk designations in our xenobiological registry. He activated the chamber's projection system. Earth's file appeared. Conclave surveillance data compiled over 40 years of covert observation, the wars, the weapons, the sheer catalog of violence that humanity had produced in its short, ferocious history. The nuclear tests, the chemical weapons stockpiles, the casualty figures from conflicts that had ended and the ones that hadn't, biological hazard assessments, atmospheric toxicity reports from weapons testing sites, a footnote on the human immune system that described it as effectively waging constant internal warfare against thousands of simultaneous microbial invasions. Veen presented it all with the careful framing of someone who thought they were revealing something damning. The chamber watched. And then something happened that Veen had not prepared for. Mara Voss watched too. She watched the entire presentation without expression. She did not protest or defend or attempt to minimize. She let Veen run through every piece of data, every conflict, every weapons system, every piece of evidence that humanity was exactly what the files said it was: volatile, violent, and relentlessly, exhaustingly dangerous. When Veen finished, the chamber turned to look at her. She stood up. "Everything in that file is accurate," she said. Veen blinked. "We have fought wars for territory, resources, ideology, religion, and spite," Voss continued. "We have developed weapons capable of ending all life on our planet, and we came disturbingly close to using them on more than one occasion. Our history is, by almost any measurable standard, a record of what happens when a highly intelligent, highly aggressive species is given tools before it's developed the wisdom to use them responsibly. I'm not going to argue with any of that." The chamber was very quiet. "What I will tell you," she said, "is what that file doesn't contain." She reached into her jacket and produced a small data chip, which she held up briefly before walking to the chamber's data interface and inserting it without asking permission. A new projection appeared. Not weapons, not casualty reports, not toxicity assessments. It was a graph. Multivariable, spanning 200 years with dozens of overlapping trend lines, and every single one of them across 2 centuries of data was moving in the same direction. Down. "War fatalities as a percentage of global population," Voss said. "Down 87% over 200 years. Child mortality, down 91%. Extreme poverty by any measurable standard, down from 40% of our global population to under 9. Life expectancy, up 40 years in 2 centuries. Literacy. Global literacy in 1820 was approximately 12%. As of this year, it is 96. We are still violent. We are still dangerous. We still have weapons we should not have, and conflicts we have not resolved. I am not standing here to tell you that humanity is good. I am standing here to tell you that humanity is improving. And we are improving faster than any species in this chamber's history improved at our developmental stage. Faster, in fact, than several of your current member civilizations were improving when they applied for conclave membership." She turned to look directly at the Sarathi delegation. The Sarathi were admitted to the conclave 312 years ago. At the time of their admission, they were 40 years removed from the crystalline purges, a series of internal conflicts that resulted in the destruction of approximately 30% of their civilian population. The conclave admitted them anyway, because the trajectory mattered more than the history. She turned to the Ethians. The Ethian collective achieved unified planetary government 61 years before their admission application. Earth achieved unified planetary government 9 years ago. We are moving faster, not because we are better, because we had the advantage of watching you, watching all of you, and understanding what was possible. She pulled the data chip from the interface. The projection disappeared. "We have known about the conclave for 40 years. We have been watching your sessions, translating your broadcasts, building models of your political structures, and learning your languages, all 6 official ones, plus several unofficial ones that your own diplomats pretend not to speak in formal settings. We did not reach out because we were not ready. We are reaching out now because we are, and because you sent the invitation." She sat down. The chamber was silent for a very long time. It was First Speaker Tharis of the Sarathi who spoke first, the same delegate who had warned 3 days ago that this was going to go wrong, who had the most institutional authority to say, "I told you so," and choose instead to say something else. "The Sarathi crystalline purges," Tharis said slowly. "You knew the figures." "Yes. That data is sealed in the conclave's restricted archive." "I know. I told you I made educated guesses. I was probably right about more than 80%. Tharis made a sound that the cultural translator rendered, after a moment's processing delay, as a very dry laugh. Ambassador Voss, said Grand Arbiter Mensol from the presiding seat. I would like to ask you a direct question. Please. Why did you come? Not Earth. You. There are approximately 9 billion humans on your planet. The diplomatic corps chose you. Why? Voss considered this with the same direct honesty she had applied to everything else. Because I'm the best at this, she said. And because I have a low tolerance for rooms full of powerful people avoiding hard problems. And you believe the conclave is such a room? I believe every room with power in it has that tendency, including rooms on Earth, including rooms I've been in. The size of the room doesn't change the problem. It just changes the scale of what gets avoided. Mensol was quiet for a moment. The observer designation carries a standard review period of 50 years before membership consideration. I know. There is a provision in the original compact, Article 3, I believe you may already be aware, for an accelerated review in cases of extraordinary diplomatic contribution. Voss was still. Her expression didn't change. But something in the room seemed to shift, as though the air pressure had altered slightly. I'm aware of Article 3, she said. The Sarathi, said Theris, would be willing to second a motion for accelerated review. As would the Sithali, said Cultural Liaison Sierri, who had not spoken since the docking bay, and appeared to have spent the intervening time deeply regretting the section of her paper that Voss had critiqued. Veen opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, said nothing. The accelerated review passed. It was not a unanimous vote. Nothing in the conclave ever was. There were 8 dissenting votes, all from smaller member civilizations who feared, not unreasonably, that admitting a species with 9 billion individuals, a Class Omega homeworld, and a demonstrated capacity for outreading a classified archive on first contact was going to change the conclave's internal dynamics in ways they could not fully predict. They were right. It was going to change everything. The formal admission process took 18 months, a blink, by conclave standards. During those 18 months, Mara Voss remained on Conclave Station Aurum as Earth's provisional representative, operating officially in an advisory capacity that everyone understood was not advisory in any meaningful sense. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She did not, as several member delegations had privately braced for, attempt to dismantle anything. She asked questions. She asked them constantly, relentlessly, with a focused precision that was initially mistaken for interrogation and eventually understood to be something more like architecture. She was building something in her head, layer by layer. And the questions were the material. The Sithali Grand Archivist, a creature who had been alive for 400 years and had spoken to perhaps 12 individuals in all that time, began voluntarily seeking out her company. The Sarathi first speaker took to including her in pre-session briefings as a matter of course. Even Velthari Us, the protocol ambassador who had felt so thoroughly assessed in the docking bay, found himself consulting her on matters that were technically outside her provisional brief. She was, in some way that none of them had language for yet, useful, not in the transactional way that conclave politics defined usefulness, but in the way a structural element is useful, quietly load-bearing, easy to underestimate until it's gone. Councillor Dra resigned from the Outreach Committee 6 weeks after the summit. He cited personal reasons. Sub-Councillor Veen did not resign. He remained in his seat for the full duration of the admission process, attending every session, saying very little, and carrying himself with the careful dignity of a person who has understood, fully and permanently, that he has made a significant error and intends to spend the remainder of his career not compounding it. It was, in the private assessment of several colleagues, the most graceful thing he had ever done. On the day of Earth's formal admission to the Galactic Conclave, a gray November morning by Earth's calendar, celebrated on the station with a ceremony that Voss had politely declined to have named after her, Grand Arbiter Mensol summoned her to the presiding chamber before the official proceedings began. The Grand Arbiter was old, older than the station, older than the version of the compact that now included Earth and its signatories. She sat in the center of the empty chamber with the patient stillness of something that has watched long enough to know that most things people worry about are temporary. "The invitation," said Mensel. Voss stood at the chamber floor and looked up. "What about it? When you received it, when your diplomatic corps decoded the transmission and understood what it was, did you know it was not genuine?" Voss considered this for a moment. "We suspected it wasn't a standard first contact protocol. The phrasing was inconsistent with what we'd observed of conclave communications, and the timing was convenient in a way that suggested opportunism rather than policy. You came anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Voss looked up at the vaulted ceiling again, the bioluminescent architecture, the star maps, the 400 years of wait. "Because a door is a door," she said. "It doesn't matter why it opened." Menzel regarded her with those enormous, slow eyes. "The Sarathi were right," the Grand Arbiter said finally. "When this invitation was sent, First Speaker Theris argued against it on the grounds that contact with your species was premature and potentially destabilizing. She told me. She now argues that Earth's admission is the most significant event in the Conclave's history since the founding. She told me that too. Which do you believe is accurate?" Voss thought about this with the same direct, unperformative honesty that she applied to everything. "Both," she said. "It was premature. We weren't ready. Not really. I was ready. But 9 billion people aren't ready just because their best diplomat is. It was also the most significant thing to happen here in a very long time. Both things can be true." Mensel was quiet. "One more question," the Grand Arbiter said. "Of course. The postscript. In your original response to the invitation, we were waiting to see if you were worth talking to. Have you decided?" Mara Voss looked around the empty chamber, the sigils on the walls, the mosaics of star systems, the seats of 300 civilizations that had, over 400 years, built something that was imperfect and slow and frequently frustrating and still, stubbornly, trying. She smiled. "Yes," she said, "provisionally." Mensel made a sound that the translator rendered, after a delay, as laughter, slow and deep and rich with 4 centuries of perspective. "Provisionally," the Grand Arbiter repeated. "That is honest." "We're working on it," Voss said. "Both of us." The admission ceremony was brief, by conclave standards. Earth's sigil was added to the chamber wall. A small blue-green circle, placed in the lower right quadrant where new members always went, with plenty of room above it, as the years accumulated and the record grew. Mara Voss stood at the central floor and accepted the formal welcome from Grand Arbiter Mensol and the assembled delegates of 6 civilizations, 300 chairs, and 400 years of history. She did not cry. She did not make a long speech. She said, "Thank you. We'll try not to break anything." The laughter that followed was, for the first time since her arrival, entirely genuine. All 300 delegates, 6 species, every translator variant finding the same thing in those 5 words. Not the performance of confidence, not the display of power, not the show of competence that had dominated every moment since she'd stepped off a scratched-up ship held together with rubber and audacity. Just a person, standing in an enormous room, doing her best, which was, it turned out, more than enough. Somewhere in the diplomatic archive of Conclave Station Aurum, in a file that would eventually be studied by historians of 4 species and quoted in a dozen academic papers on first contact theory, was a brief internal memo from Protocol Ambassador Velthari Us, written on the evening of the first day of the 412th summit, addressed to no one in particular, which read, "The invitation was supposed to be a joke. For future reference, the next time we consider sending a message to a species we've flagged as dangerous, volatile, and impossible to predict, perhaps consider the possibility that those words describe something that is difficult, not something that is less. There is a difference. I understand it now. I suspect I will spend some time thinking about how long it took me to learn it. Below that, in the margin, in a different hand, smaller, neater, the handwriting of someone who had been using the protocol ambassador's office to review files, was a single additional line. Good start.